Hey everyone, good evening. It's February 2nd, 2026. I'm Simrie Johnson, and you are listening to Histories of Horror.
And I'm A.L. Knuckles. Welcome back to Histories of Horror. If you're listening to us tonight from a quiet porch in the Panhandle or a high rise near Destin, I want you to look at your front door. We think those locks as a barrier between us and the monsters outside. But tonight, we're talking about the horror that's already inside the house, sitting at the breakfast table.
Tonight, we're traveling back to September 1998. We're leaving the modern headlines behind and heading into the humid, pine thick air of Crestview, Florida, a place I've personally visited many times. Back then, it was a quiet military town close to Eglin Air Force Base. It was the kind of place where people came to start over after their service. But in the early hours of September morning, that peace was shattered by a 12-gauge shotgun.
The man behind the trigger was Jeffrey Hutchinson. This wasn't some drifter or a career criminal. Hutchinson was a Gulf War veteran, a man who had worn the uniform of the United States Army. To the outside world, he was a protector. To his girlfriend, Renee Flaherty, he was the man she trusted to help raise her three young children.
But the reality inside that mobile home on a wooded lot was far from the domestic ideal. When the neighbors saw a veteran, Renee was seeing a man spiraling into a dark, controlling volatility. As we always say on this show, the more decorated the uniform, the heavier the shadows it can cast. Jeffrey had been diagnosed with Gulf War illness, symptoms including memory loss and insomnia. But whether that explains the carnage we're discussing tonight is the question that has haunted Florida for decades.
To understand why this case has spent nearly 30 years winding through the Florida court system, you have to understand the sheer brutality of that morning. It wasn't a crime of passion that ended in a moment. It was a systematic execution.
It started with a 911 call from Hutchinson himself at 8:41 p.m. on September 11th, 1998. He was screaming, "I just shot my family. I love my family." But when the deputies arrived, the story changed. He claimed that men in black or two masked men had broken in and that they had killed his family while he was powerless to stop them.
When deputies arrived at the home in Crestview, they found Jeffrey lying in the garage in a daze, his cordless phone still connected to the operator. Inside, they found a nightmare. Renee Flaherty, age 32, and her three children, 9-year-old Jeffrey, 7-year-old Amanda, and 4-year-old Logan, had all been shot at close range.
The physical evidence was overwhelming. The murder weapon, a Mossberg 12-gauge pistol grip shotgun belonging to Jeffrey, was sitting right there on the kitchen counter. Investigators found gunshot residue on his hands and, most chillingly, human tissue from young Jeffrey on Jeffrey's leg.
Despite his claims of intruders, there was no sign of a break in. The front door was deadbolted from the inside. The defense would later spend decades arguing that Hutchinson's mind was a casualty of the Gulf War, that sarin gas exposure and PTSD had created a dissociative state. They painted a picture of a man who didn't know he was holding a gun.
But the prosecution argued a much older motive. Renee was planning to leave him. He had spent the evening at a bar, stewing over an argument, and then he went back home to ensure that if he couldn't have her, no one could. He killed Renee first as she lay in bed, then the two children in the room with her, and finally Jeffrey, who was shot twice, once while in a defensive posture.
This is where the story takes a turn that is truly bizarre, Cy. Over the years on death row, Jeffrey didn't just stick to the masked men story. He began to build an entire alternate reality. He started telling everyone, or anyone, who would listen that he was part of a secret government project and that the murders were a hit performed by deep state agents to keep him quiet about what he saw in Iraq.
It's a classic defense tactic we often see on Histories of Horror, the pivot from "I didn't do it" to "I'm too sick to understand why I'm being punished." His lawyers leaned heavily into the Agent Orange of the 90s, the chemical exposures from the Gulf War. They argued his brain was literally physically altered, causing him to live in a permanent state of delusion where he truly believed he was innocent.
But the prosecution pointed out a very inconvenient truth for Jeffrey. He was selective with his delusions. When it came to legal strategy or talking to his lawyers about his rights, he was sharp as a tack. It was only when the topic of the actual shotgun blast came up that his mind suddenly became a fog of war.
And that's the cruce of the debate that's lasted for 25 years. Is a veteran's trauma a shield that protects them from the ultimate penalty, or is it just another layer of the tragedy? The community in Crestview, Florida never forgot those three children. For them, the delusion wasn't in Jeffrey's head, it was the idea that he could ever walk free again.
Even in prison, Jeffrey was a decisive figure. Some saw a broken soldier who needed a hospital, not a needle. Others saw a manipulator who used his veteran status to garner sympathy, while the remains of a 4-year-old were the only testament to his true character. This psychological tug of war is what made the 2025 warrant so explosive. We've seen many cases on History of Horror where the legal battle lasts longer than the lives of the victims. For the Flaherty family, the last 28 years have been a grueling cycle of stays of execution and competency hearings.
Jeffrey spent 24 years on death row. The case reached a boiling point last year in 2025. On April 1st, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. That triggered a frantic final month of litigation focused on one thing: was Jeffrey Hutchinson competent enough to be executed?
His attorneys argued he suffered from a fixed delusion, that he believed the government was executing him to silence his knowledge of secrets. They even had experts testify that he lacked a rational understanding of why he was being punished. They cited his Gulf War trauma as the source of a complete mental break.
But the state's expert disagreed. They call it malingering, essentially faking the depth of his delusions to avoid the needle. They pointed out that his intruder story had changed too many times over 30 years. Ultimately, the Florida Supreme Court and Judge James Colau ruled that he was sane and competent.
On May 1st, 2025, the legal road finally ended. Jeffrey Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was 62 years old. For Renee's brother, Leslie Elmore, who flew in to witness it, it was a moment of justice for a sister and three nibblings who never got to grow up.
It brings up the haunting question we grapple with: does a history of service and a claim of mental illness or a war torn brain absolve a person of the choice to pull a trigger on a 4-year-old boy? The courts in Florida finally said no.
As we reflect on this case here in February 2026, we're left with the echoes of those 4 lives. Jeffrey Hutchinson's story didn't end in a foxhole in the Middle East. It ended in a sterile room in Rayford, decades after he destroyed his own sanctuary.
As always, thank you for joining us for this look into one of Florida's longest running death row sagas. No matter how much time passes, the tragedy in Crestview remains a stark reminder that the most dangerous battlefields are sometimes found in our own homes. I'm Simrie Johnson, and from A.L. Knuckles and I, we'll see you next time on Histories of Horror.